there. Good morning, Dr. Fawley.
Good morning.
Is it fair to say that you're not exactly enthusiastic about the deal, that you're supporting it through gritted teeth?
Well, it's very difficult to get a deal that's going to appeal equally to those who are fervently in favour of remaining and those fervently in favour of leaving. The government, however, has to achieve a balance. And in the area of trade, it has to be this, that the European Union accounts for about 44%, 45% of the UK's exports of goods and services. It remains a very important market for us. So we have to maintain our access to that European market as we leave the European Union, but without tying our hands unduly in terms of what we can achieve elsewhere in the growing markets of the world. And remember that the IMF tell us that 90% of global growth in the next 5 years will be outside continental Europe. So it's a balance between the two.
It's a compromise deal, but it's a compromise that it seems that a good many of your colleagues, we hear perhaps nearly 100, aren't enthusiastic about. In fact, they say they're against the deal. So doesn't it seem pretty well impossible that Theresa May is going to win this vote that's coming up?
Well, I think the Prime Minister has been changing the public mood. If you look at what's been happening in polling, there's clearly a shift there. And members of Parliament have to...
It's the MPs who have the vote, not the public.
Exactly. And members of Parliament need to... they'll need to make their own decisions for themselves, but they have to compare this particular deal against the alternatives. Those who don't want us to leave the EU without a deal need to consider that this would increase the chance of that were we to vote against it. I think that the public will expect us to take that balanced view. Trade changes and the way in which we weigh up the options will change over time.
But it used to be that no deal was better than a bad deal. And actually, you don't think that no deal would be too bad, do you?
Well, I think as the Roberto Azevedo, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, has said, it wouldn't be a disaster, but it wouldn't be a walk in the park either. And we have to understand that there are consequences to these. I think that the reactions to some of the Treasury analysis has been completely overblown. I think people have not understood.
Reaction to the Treasury analysis or the Treasury analysis itself?
Well, I think people have not understood, and I have to say that the media have been somewhat responsible for this. They didn't understand the difference between forecasts and scenarios, and they are fundamentally different. A forecast is when you take all the variables and decide what the most likely outcome is when you take them all into account. A scenario isolates everything but one variable. So, for example, a worst-case deal isn't going to happen because the worst-case deal assumes that the government wouldn't take any mitigating measures.
Well, okay, the worst case, okay, but yes, and I understand the differences. What we're talking about is not dynamic forecast, but under pretty well every scenario, certainly according to the Bank of England, Mark Carney is saying that in every scenario, the UK will be worse off compared with staying with the EU.
Well, that, of course, depends on what happens in the global economy outside the EU and what access Britain has to that. Those assumptions can't really be built in at the present time.
He's wrong then, is he, the Governor of the Bank of
Well,
England?
I think that I don't agree with some of the ways in which the picture has been calculated. But as I say, those who are making these scenarios were very clear that they weren't forecasts. I think that Britain will be better.
But some of this is analysis from your own government, from the Treasury. You're saying that the Treasury is wrong as well as the government.
No, the Treasury, they're not wrong. They set out scenarios, but the assumptions are that the government wouldn't take any other actions to mitigate those, which clearly isn't the case.
But would they be able to take sufficient action in order to mitigate the loss of growth that's been...
It's been very clear. It was very clear. I don't want to keep going back over the ground of a few days ago, but it was very clear that these were not forecasts, that what they were economic exercises looking at what the effects of specific variables without taking into account the others.
Let's focus on Theresa May's deal. The Financial Times is reporting that Michael Gove has been enlisted to sell the backstop to Brexiteer colleagues. This is the controversial insurance policy to prevent an Irish border. You can't hand on heart go out and say that the backstop is a good idea, can you?
Well, the whole question of the backstop, and I don't for a second pretend to be enthusiastic about the backstop, the backstop was a way in which we could achieve the withdrawal agreement by giving the Irish government confidence that we wouldn't end up with a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. Of course, what you also have to take into account is that the backstop is extremely unpopular with some of our European partners. Irish business, for example, will say that this would give Northern Ireland a huge advantage over businesses in the south and would likely to lead to businesses moving north. There are others in Europe.
Well, that may be the case, but what we're talking about is a legal document that your government has signed, which could mean that we're trapped in the customs union with many disadvantages, some of them hampering the very free trade agreements which your job is designed to do.
I think the backstop is so unpalatable to those in Europe that we'll never get there. And I think there is a genuine desire to get to a future economic partnership as quickly as possible.
But you can't bank on that, can you? This is a legal document. I mean, it is a perfectly possible scenario that we're in transition for 2 years, possibly 4 years. After that, stuck in the customs union, because the EU will use it as a negotiating lever.
Well, there, as I say, the European Union itself, in many countries, the backstop is very unpopular. For example, they will say it means that Britain, if it doesn't get everything it likes, can remain effectively in the single market without either free movement or making any financial contributions, which of course would be anathema to countries like Norway or Switzerland. And so you have to look at this question as a whole. And as the Attorney General has said, there is risk in all of this, but on both sides. And we need to be able to get through the withdrawal agreement. I heard
how long before our first deal, before our first trade deal?
Well, we can't have any trade agreements until we're actually out of the implementation period. So that would be the 1st of January 2021.
Yeah, but it could be very hard to negotiate anything by then. And the likelihood people are talking about is extending the transition period and then the backstop.
I don't think they're saying that that's the likelihood at all. It is possible if both sides wanted to do so, because we hadn't technically completed things like border arrangements. I think that there is a real desire to get this partnership into place as quickly as possible, because the EU also has to negotiate trade agreements. And if the people don't know who are negotiating with the EU what that market access is, then it becomes very difficult for them. So there's pressure in both directions.
But looking at the kind of model that we might have in terms of our future trading relationship, looking at the document that we have so far, it talks about using the independent customs arrangement as the model. Now, under that, it would be impossible, wouldn't it, for you to have an independent trade policy?
Well, what was being proposed was some alignment on manufacturing goods so that we did not have to have border inspection. And that was the basis on which we took forward the agreement that was referred to as the Chequers Agreement in the Cabinet at the time.
We talked to your former advisor, Shankar Singham, a real expert on this earlier, and you know he's a real expert. He says that you're making a big mistake because under this policy, you can't have an independent trade policy.
I disagree that you can't have an independent trade policy. So, for example, if you're talking to the United States, a live example, one of their main concerns is that they can get access to the UK market for things like American cars at lower or zero tariff rates. That's entirely possible, even under that model. So what you have is regulatory alignment. But if you go to General Motors and say, would you have a second production line to sell to different standards to the United Kingdom, they'd say, no, that's not economically viable. So you've got to differentiate here between theory and what is practice and what is likely.
Well, interesting that you bring up the United States, because you'll be well aware of what Donald Trump has said recently. He said, sounds like a great deal for the EU. And he says, right now, if you look at the deal, they may not be able to trade with us, and that wouldn't be a good thing.
Well, of course we'll be able to trade with the United States. It's our single biggest trading partner. We have a huge investment relationship as well. We have $1 trillion invested in one another's economy. We'll clearly be able to trade. We trade with them under EU rules at the present time. So that clearly is going to continue.
EU, but will they really be able to trade with us on the basis that they want if they're having to obey EU regulations?
Well, in terms of regulations in manufactured goods, which I'm referring to, it's the practical aspects. Are we really saying that American companies will develop a new product line for a separate range of regulations in the UK? What about the cost of UK business?
What about food, where there has been divergence with the EU? I mean, the notorious examples are chlorinated chicken, hormone-fed beef.
Well, on those areas, we will maintain our own standards. We're not simply there to do what we're told by any trade partner. We have our own legislation in the UK protecting our own standards. And even if we had the freedom to do so, I think you'd find considerable resistance from consumers to changing some of those things. So we've just had a major consultation, one of the biggest the government's ever had, asking the public about what our ambitions should be in future trade policy. And one of the things they've been clear about is maintaining British standards. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing for us to want to do. That, of course, limits what we can do in terms of a trade agreement, but we're not there to reduce standards for the British public.
Do you think the whole Cabinet is going to vote for this deal?
I think members of the Cabinet will vote for the deal. Members of the Cabinet who don't vote for the deal won't be members of the Cabinet.
And you will definitely be voting for it?
I think that we have to have this balance. We could certainly have a trade policy that was much freer in terms of what we could get in free trade agreements elsewhere in the world. That's for sure.
Okay.
But the price could be the loss of access to the European market, which, as I say, is 44% of Britain's exports. That's a lot of jobs, a lot of profits. The government is not there to do what we want. We're there to do what's in the national interest.
Liam Fox, thank you. We're listening to that.